I have always loved the God of War games because they offered a decent story coupled with fun gameplay. We would usually see a steady jump in quality with each new game. That was the case up until 2018. That year, God of War entered the Norse mythology and the quality increased in pretty much every way imaginable. The graphics were fantastic, the story had never been this deep, there was a real character development and Kratos began showing more than just anger or fury. There were proper emotions in play here. We were even introduced to his new son as a constant companion, and what could have been an annoying escort mission turned out to be a great addition to both story and gameplay. I remember reaching the game's credits and thinking to myself how there would be no way the devs could ever reach, let alone surpass the quality of this release with the next one. 4 years later, and here we are, with God of War Ragnarok finally being released. I played it on the PlayStation 4 Pro since I don't have a 5, but it still ran quite well. So 70 hours later, having beaten every optional boss, done all the game's quests, crafted every armor, and pretty much squeezed this game dry, I'm ready to tell you what I thought of it. First and foremost, Ragnarok is very similar to its predecessor. The devs did not take any risks when it comes to that. For the most part, both the exploration as well as the combat remain almost identical. We gain stats by upgrading our gear, and after passing a certain level of each stat, our overall level increases as well. We can level up Kratos' skills as well as those of his companions. The leveling happens very naturally and you can still win fights even when you are under-leveled, although some of those can be very challenging. The exploration still happens on foot as well as on boat in almost equal parts. The maps are what I would describe as semi-open world. What I mean by that is that in many cases you are restricted to corridors, but there's so many of them, which ultimately creates the feeling of a nearly open world, since you can explore in almost every direction. Some are locked by obstacles which can only be opened up later as you progress through the story. At first, I found that to be quite annoying, since the game essentially asks me to revisit old maps, but when the time came to do so, I realized that what had happened was not just a minor change. In some cases, we would essentially get new maps which would open up, and they would come with their own quests and side bosses. Exploration in God of War is balanced really well. For example, there are 48 ravens hidden throughout the game's maps. I was killing them while playing naturally without trying to look up any guides, which resulted in me having only missed 3 of them by the time I finished the main quest. That is also when I used the guide in order to find the remaining ones. Imagine if there had been 100 of them and I was only able to find less than half by playing naturally. That would have been bad game design, and I have seen it in some games. In addition to that, we also have the optional bosses, which are very strong and pose a huge challenge. I can easily say that beating some of them was comparable to beating bosses in Dark Souls. These challenges are here for those who wish to prove themselves in combat and can be made all the more difficult if you decide to tackle them early on, when they outlevel you substantially. I did so with 2 of those bosses who spawn at the same time and spent the next several hours in this fight. The interesting thing was that I kept making small changes to my strategy and seeing incremental improvements, which in turn made these grindy encounters fun even though I was getting my ass handed to me. But enough about the bosses, let's focus on God of War's main course, the story. Ragnarok starts pretty much where the previous game left off. There are more gods to kill and more drama to unfold. Atreus, Kratos' son, has grown and is slowly becoming a young man. You can see this in the way Kratos interacts with him. He has recognized that his son is no longer a little boy and is beginning to show him respect. He doesn't refer to him as boy anymore. And we can see that Atreus is reaching his rebellious phase where he wants to find his own path rather than following the one his father has chosen for him. The story is crafted so well, it even gives us an explanation for the more gamey things with which other games simply don't bother. For example, all of our gear is weak at the start of Ragnarok. If you've played the first game, you probably had everything maxed out by the end of it. The story tells us that Fimbulwinter, which is a cataclysmic event, has begun. It's also the precursor to Ragnarok, a huge final war foretold to bring the end of the world with itself. And Fimbulwinter causes all things to deteriorate in different ways, including our gear, which is now weaker and essentially broken. So even the fact that we start with bad gear after we had bothered to upgrade it before gets an explanation from this game's story. I respect and appreciate that. The beauty of the game's story is how well the characters are developed within it, above all. I can't go into details because that would spoil the fun of experiencing it for yourself, but what I can say is that the game easily beats its predecessor in that aspect. And this doesn't only apply to our main protagonists Kratos and Atreus, but also for almost all of the side characters. What really impressed me was how masterfully this task was executed over the span of the game's story. In some games, the character development feels forced or sudden, but Ragnarok is in no hurry, and every time someone's behavior or allegiances change, it makes sense in the context of the story. Something important to consider here is the fact that you must have played God of War 2018 before this one in order to fully comprehend what is happening. Otherwise, I can imagine a lot of stuff is going to be confusing to you. The game starts off with an epic fight between Thor and Kratos, and it's just as cinematic and bombastic as the early fight against Baldur in 2018. And speaking of Thor, I have to say that I love the way he is depicted. It's a delight to finally see something other than the American comic book depiction of the Norse gods. The best way for me to describe them in Ragnarok would be as more believable and realistic. They're imperfect beings giving incredible powers, but also flaws which you would normally find within humans, which leads to all kinds of dramatic twists as the story progresses. When it comes to the voice acting, nobody will be surprised to hear that it is outstanding. Even the newest cast members provide us with excellent performances, making their characters feel like real living people. The music in this game is also awesome, so awesome in fact that I still listen to some of it simply because I enjoyed it. Not all songs are winners, but those that left a positive impression on me left a major one. Last but not least, I want to address the brutal combat. The game's not afraid to show us gore, and anyone who has played God of War games before will be satisfied with the amount of brutal takedowns available to Kratos and his followers. In addition to that, we get a bunch of environmental puzzles which range from super easy to moderately difficult. This means that the player will rarely find himself in a situation where you can see what you want but have no idea on how to reach it. As someone who can get frustrated if a puzzle is too challenging, I can say that there was not a single time when this happened to me, and that's good news. In addition to all of that, God of War Ragnarok offers a huge variety of accessibility features, which allow you to tailor the gameplay to your personal preferences. Some of those will simply make the game slightly easier, for example the feature which sets a checkpoint on mini-bosses once they lose half of their HP, allowing you to essentially start over from that point if you should die, while others are really geared towards players with disabilities, making it easier to play the game by not having to press as many buttons at the same time and essentially automating things such as picking up items, grabbing onto ledges, etc. It really is a major improvement when compared to the previous game and will surely be helpful to some of you. I like that. I wish more games would go into that much detail when it comes to these things. One thing I can complain about are the fast travel options. We still use portals in order to get from A to B, and while this makes perfect sense lore-wise, it's still annoying to have to enter a portal, then wait for the hidden loading screen to pass, then a door appears and you have to walk up to it and interact in order to enter. I would have preferred an actual loading screen where I don't have to do anything, because it doesn't require me to interact with stuff and move around, meaning that it would essentially be faster at the end of the day. They still have Mimir provide us with some nice exposition while this happens, but after some time you've exhausted all the things he has to say, and from that point on we mostly teleport in silence. With that having been said, I can't think of a single other thing I disliked about the game. Maybe it's just me, but everything was simply very enjoyable. I guess the final question to answer here is if you should play God of War Ragnarok. Well, provided you own a PS4 or PS5, yeah, you should. At some point Sony may port it to the PC as well, which will be the definitive way to play it without a doubt. But if you don't want to wait and are as impatient as I was, go for it right now. It's a thrilling ride start to finish. Thank you for watching Game Filter. This is Nino signing out.